My name is Emily Brooks. I'm 30 years old, and last Thanksgiving, my mother turned me into a joke in front of everyone I grew up with. We were gathered at a lakeside resort in Tahoe. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, a room full of relatives who hadn't seen each other all year and were already halfway through their second round of wine. My mom stood up, tapped her glass with a spoon, and smiled like she was about to make a toast everyone would remember. "I'm so proud of my girls," she said. "I have 2 daughters. One is a respected attorney in San Francisco." She paused, just long enough. "And the other, well, she's still figuring things out." The room laughed. Not politely, not awkwardly. They really laughed. Someone added, "At least she's creative." Someone else said, "That's one way to put it." My father shook his head and joked that I'd always marched to my own beat. Like that explained everything. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, wearing a sweater I bought on clearance, listening to people who had known me my entire life talk about me like I wasn't in the room. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just stood up, walked out into the cold night air, and drove away without saying a single word. What none of them knew was that the woman they laughed at had been quietly paying their bills for years. A week later, my phone started lighting up before sunrise. Declined cards, frozen accounts, mortgage warnings, panic. If you're wondering how a so-called beggar managed to become the invisible safety net holding an entire family together, stay with me. And if stories about family betrayal, quiet strength, and karma that arrives without shouting resonate with you, take a moment to subscribe to this channel now. These stories are worth finishing, even when life pulls you away. Because by the end of this one, you'll understand how the joke stopped being funny, and why the people who laughed the loudest were the ones who had the most to lose. Let me tell you what really happened after that dinner. Families like to believe they're fair. They like to say they love their children equally, that everyone is supported in their own way. But what they don't admit is that over time, every family builds a story. And once that story is set, it's very hard to escape. In my family, the story was simple. My sister Claire was the success. My brother Mark was the potential. And I was the one who never quite got there. Claire's path was decided early. Good grades, the right schools, law school acceptance letters proudly shared at family gatherings. When people asked about her, my parents straightened their backs. Their voices changed. They spoke with certainty. Mark didn't have Claire's discipline, but he had confidence. Big plans, big energy. My father loved that about him. He took Mark everywhere, talked to him like a partner instead of a son. Everyone said Mark was going to run something big someday. And then there was me. I wasn't a problem child. I didn't rebel. I didn't fail out of school. I just didn't fit into the version of success my family understood. I liked working quietly. I liked understanding how things connected. I could spend hours solving problems no one asked me to solve. I didn't talk much about it because every time I did, the reaction was the same. A polite smile, a quick nod. Then the conversation moved on. So I stopped offering explanations. At family dinners, my parents spoke for me. "Emily's still figuring things out. Emily's doing her own thing. Emily's creative." Creative was their favorite word for me. It sounded kind, but it meant temporary, unstable, not serious. As the years passed, the jokes became routine. Not cruel enough to fight, not kind enough to forget. When relatives asked what I did for work, someone would laugh and say, "Oh, you know Emily, she's always got something going on." And everyone understood what that meant. Claire's career was announced like an achievement. Mark's risks were called ambition. My choices were framed as delays. I learned how to sit through it. I learned how to smile without inviting questions, how to laugh at myself before someone else could, how to excuse myself early so I wouldn't have to hear another comparison dressed up as concern. The only person who didn't play along was my grandfather. He never bragged about me. He never defended me loudly. He just listened. When I spoke, he didn't interrupt. When I was quiet, he didn't rush me. Once, after a holiday dinner, where someone joked that I was still finding myself, he walked me outside and said something I didn't understand at the time. He said every family needs someone to stand lower, so everyone else can feel taller. Be careful, they don't decide, that's your job. I didn't think about those words again until Tahoe, because that Thanksgiving dinner wasn't random. It wasn't just my mother having too much wine or saying something careless. It was the story finally being told out loud. When she called me a beggar, she wasn't inventing a role for me. She was naming the one they had already given me, the one who hadn't made it, the one it was safe to laugh at. And what hurt more than her words was what didn't happen next. No one corrected her. No one changed the subject. No one said, "That's not fair." They laughed because the story felt familiar. By the time I stood up from that table, I understood something with painful clarity. They didn't just doubt me. They needed me to stay exactly where I was, because as long as I was the example of what not to be, everyone else could feel secure in who they thought they were. That was the family story, and for a long time, I let myself live inside it, until the night I finally walked away and realized some stories only survive because the person they're written about stays silent. When I got back to my apartment that night, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood there in the dark coat, still on keys, still in my hand, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. It was quiet in a way that felt earned. No laughter, no commentary, no one explaining who I was supposed to be. People like to imagine moments like that as dramatic, crying on the floor, throwing things, calling a friend, but that's not how it went. I sat down at my small kitchen table, opened my laptop, and stared at the screen the same way I had done 1,000 nights before. Not because I was numb, but because this was the part of my life no one had ever been curious enough to ask about. My family thought they knew what my days looked like. They pictured me drifting between gigs, working odd hours, barely scraping by, always one step behind real adulthood. That version of me was comfortable for them. The real version started years earlier in a rented office space above a dry cleaner in Colorado Springs. Flickering lights, secondhand desks, a space heater that never quite worked. I was in my mid-20s then, coming off another polite family dinner, where someone had asked when I planned to settle down into something stable. What I was actually doing was building systems, quiet ones, boring ones if you didn't understand how money moved or why small inefficiencies ruined people faster than bad luck ever could. I didn't talk about it much because every time I tried, the conversation died halfway through my first sentence. So I stopped offering explanations and let people assume. I met Daniel around that time. He was older than me, practical, and allergic to big speeches. He listened. That alone made him different. We started working together not because we had some grand vision, but because we kept noticing the same thing. People weren't bad with money. They were exhausted. They missed payments, not because they were careless, but because life stacked too many decisions on top of each other. Late fees, overdrafts, shortfalls that snowballed quietly, while everyone pretended they were fine. So we built something simple, not flashy, not something my family would have bragged about. A back-end service that helped people automate the unglamorous parts of staying afloat. Rules, alerts, safety margins. The kind of thing you don't notice until it's gone. At first, It barely made anything. I kept my other work. Long days, late nights. My parents would call and ask how things were going, and I'd say, fine. That was all they wanted anyway. Somewhere along the way, the calls changed. Mark called first, his voice tight, trying to sound casual. The gym was struggling. Equipment lease issues. A rough quarter. He just wanted advice. Nothing more. Then my sister. A billing delay. A reimbursement that hadn't come through yet. She asked if I knew a good way to juggle things for a month or two. My parents followed. Rising costs. A temporary cash crunch. They said it like it was a weather issue. Unavoidable. No big deal. They never asked how I knew what I knew. They never asked what I was building. They just assumed I had time to help. So I did. Not loudly. Not with speeches. I adjusted systems. I ran numbers. I smoothed things out. Small interventions that looked like luck from the outside. Payments arriving just in time. Accounts staying barely in the clear. No one called it dependence. They called it relief. And the strangest part was this. The more I helped, the smaller I became in their eyes. As if my usefulness confirmed their belief that I was still just filling gaps, not building anything real. That night after Tahoe, I stared at my screen and realized something unsettling. They trusted my competence completely. They just didn't respect me enough to see it. And that was when I started asking myself a question I had avoided for years. What happens when the person no one takes seriously stops quietly holding everything together? There's a difference between helping once and quietly becoming the thing that keeps everything from falling apart. I didn't wake up one day and decide to support my entire family. It happened the way most heavy things do, slowly, quietly. One small decision layered on top of another until the weight felt normal. It started with Mark's gym. After the flood, he called me late one night, his voice low, embarrassed, in a way I'd never heard before. Insurance was dragging its feet. Equipment payments were coming due. He said he just needed help figuring out timing, nothing more. So I ran the numbers, not emotionally, practically. I built a buffer into my own system. If his revenue dipped below a certain line, a shortfall would be covered automatically. Not forever, just enough to keep him from defaulting. He never saw the transfer. He just saw the problem disappear. A few months later, it was my sister. Claire never asked for money directly. She asked questions instead, about billing cycles, about credit utilization, about how to keep things from tipping over while she waited for reimbursements from her firm. I didn't lecture her. I didn't say I told you so. I just adjusted another rule. Small monthly payments that knocked down high interest balances before they could spiral. Nothing dramatic. Nothing she could point to and say, Emily saved me. Then there were my parents. Medical bills they pretended not to worry about. Property taxes that arrived earlier than expected. A mortgage that hovered just close enough to danger to make me uneasy. They never said they were struggling. They said things like, it's just a tight month, or we'll figure it out. So I figured it out. I created what I privately called a family buffer, a set of quiet backstops that kicked in when numbers crossed lines no one else was watching. Payments made just before penalties. Balances nudged back into the safe zone. No speeches, no acknowledgments. Over time, it added up. Not all at once. Not in a way that felt impressive. Just steady, invisible support. Year after year. When I finally looked at the total one night, it stopped me cold. Just under $300,000. Money I could have used to buy a home. To slow down. To feel secure in ways my family assumed I never would. Instead, it had gone into keeping their lives smooth enough that they could continue believing everything was fine. The strange part wasn't that I helped. It was that they never noticed. My mother wore nice coats and joked about how lucky they were. My father talked about careful planning. Mark bragged about bouncing back. Claire ordered another glass of wine without glancing at the bill. And every time someone said, "We got through it," I felt a quiet ache settle somewhere behind my ribs. Because I knew what they really meant was, they got through it without ever seeing me. By the time Thanksgiving in Tahoe came around, the system had been running for years. It was so seamless that even I had started to forget how much effort it took to keep everything balanced. So when my mother called me a beggar at that table, part of me almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the irony was almost unbearable. She said it wearing something bought with a card that had only stayed out of trouble because of a payment I scheduled weeks earlier. My father laughed while sitting comfortably in a house that would have slipped into serious trouble more than once without those quiet adjustments. They weren't cruel villains. That would have been easier. They were comfortable. And comfort has a way of blinding people to the hands holding them up. That night, back in my apartment, I pulled up the dashboard and looked at everything laid out in clean lines and calm colors. Names, dates, amounts, years of proof. I didn't feel proud. I felt tired of being invisible, tired of being the quiet fix no one acknowledged, tired of being the safety net people laughed at while standing on it. I hovered my cursor over the settings, over the rules that had been quietly saving them from consequences. For a long moment, I did nothing. Then I asked myself a question that changed everything. If they truly believed I was a burden, what would happen if I finally stopped carrying theirs? I didn't make a speech. I didn't send a warning. I didn't explain myself to anyone. I just stopped. One by one, I turned off the rules I had built, the quiet transfers, the automatic buffers, the invisible fixes that stepped in right before things went wrong. There was no dramatic moment, no final click that felt like revenge. Just a series of small confirmations on my screen, each one ending with the same simple message. Saved. When I closed my laptop, my apartment felt different, not lighter, just honest. For the first time in years, my money stayed where it was, in my account. For my life, it felt unfamiliar, almost wrong, like I was forgetting something important. Nothing happened that day or the next. That was the hardest part, waiting. The first crack came early the following week. My phone buzzed before sunrise. A text from my mother. Short, confused. My card was declined this morning. Do you know what's going on? I stared at the screen longer than I needed to. For years, that moment had never reached her. The system would have stepped in. The gap would have been filled. She would have gone on believing things simply worked. I set the phone face down and made coffee. By mid-morning, there were more messages. A missed call, then another. My father this time. His voice, tight-clipped, already irritated. Something's wrong with the accounts, he said. The bank flagged a payment. This has never happened before. Never happened before because it had never been allowed to. I told him I didn't know and suggested he call the bank. He didn't like that answer. He hung up quickly the way he always did when a conversation stopped serving him. The rest unraveled faster. My sister sent a screenshot of an email from her bank. Account under review. She followed it with a message that tried to sound calm, but didn't quite succeed. Did you change something when you stayed with me last year? You're good with this stuff. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation dressed up as concern. Mark called next. He didn't leave a message, just 3 missed calls in a row. That was his tell. Panic, without words. By the end of the day, my phone felt heavier in my hand. Not because of guilt, because of clarity. Every problem they were facing wasn't new. It was just no longer hidden. The most painful part wasn't their fear, it was their assumption. No one asked if I was okay. No one asked why I might have stepped back. They jumped straight to the idea that I had done something to them, that I had broken things, that I was being petty, that I was punishing them. The idea that their lives might have been propped up by someone they dismissed never crossed their minds. On Thursday evening, my parents showed up unannounced at my apartment building. I watched them on the security camera from my phone while I sat in my car across town. My mother kept glancing down the hallway, worried someone might see her like this. My father knocked like he still had authority. When I didn't answer, I heard him say it. "She's probably hiding. She always does this when things get hard." I didn't correct him. The next day, my sister cornered me at a coffee shop near my place. She sat down without asking, her voice low and controlled like she was in a deposition. "We just need to understand what you did," she said. "The timing is suspicious." I looked at her and felt something settle inside me. Not anger, acceptance. I told her I hadn't touched her accounts. I hadn't hacked anything. I hadn't interfered. I had simply stopped helping. That was when the room changed. Her face shifted, not into relief, but into calculation. She started talking about access, about information, about how families share things, about how maybe lines had been crossed. That was when I realized something important. They weren't just scared. They were afraid of losing control over a story that had always worked in their favor. Later that night, after the messages slowed and the silence crept back in, I sat alone and listened to the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, the honest kind. For years, I had absorbed the impact of their choices so they wouldn't have to feel it. I had smoothed the edges, taken the hits, made it easier for them to believe they were doing fine. Now, without me in the way, reality was doing what it always does. It was catching up. And for the first time, the consequences weren't landing on my shoulders. They were landing exactly where they belonged. We met 3 days later at a small cafe near my apartment. It wasn't neutral ground by accident. It was close enough that I didn't have to rearrange my life to explain myself. My parents arrived, first stiff and quiet. My sister followed, dressed like she had come straight from work posture, tight jaw set. Mark came last, restless, scanning the room, like he wanted to leave before the conversation even started. No one ordered coffee. My father didn't waste time. He leaned forward and said it plainly. "Did you mess with our finances or not?" I looked at all of them before I answered. The people I had been quietly carrying for years. The same people who had laughed when my mother turned me into a punchline. "No," I said. "I didn't touch your accounts. I didn't log into anything. I didn't break a single rule." I paused, then added the part they didn't expect. "I just stopped using my money to hold your lives together." The confusion moved around the table in waves. My sister frowned first. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "You don't have that kind of money. You're always saying you're barely getting by." I nodded. "I say I'm barely getting by because after my own expenses, the rest went to you." I opened my laptop and turned the screen toward them. No flashy graphics, no dramatic animations. Just rows, dates, names, amounts, years of quiet proof laid out in calm lines. "This is where your emergencies went," I said. "Every time something almost went wrong and then didn't." Mark leaned in, squinting. "Is that my lease payment?" "Yes. When your revenue dipped after the flood, I covered the difference so you wouldn't default." My mother's breath caught. My father went very still. I clicked to the next section. My sister's name, credit balances, fees that never compounded because they never got the chance. I didn't pay everything I said. I just kept things from tipping over. The total sat at the bottom of the screen, just under $300,000. No one spoke. My mother stared at the numbers like they might rearrange themselves into a different story. My father flipped his hands over on the table, palms up then down again. Mark shook his head slowly, like denial might change the math. Finally, my sister spoke. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I knew exactly what would happen if I did," I said. "At first, you'd thank me. Then you'd expect it. And eventually, you'd forget it ever came from me at all." That's when her tone changed. She straightened slightly and said something that made my chest tighten. "You used information we shared as a family. You built systems around our situations. There's an argument to be made that what you built involves us." There it was. Not gratitude, not apology, entitlement. My father nodded slowly, as if the thought had already occurred to him. "We trusted you," he said. "You don't just get to pull support and walk away. Family doesn't work like that." I looked at him and felt something settle for good. Family doesn't get ownership over someone's labor just because it benefited from it, I said. My sister pressed on. "Maybe not ownership," she said carefully, "but a share, equity, something. You didn't build this in a vacuum." That was the moment I realized they hadn't come to understand me. They had come to negotiate. I closed my laptop. "You laughed when my mother called me a beggar," I said. "You questioned my stability. You assumed I was the problem when your money stopped working. And now that you see the truth, you don't ask how you hurt me. You ask what you're owed." No one answered that. Mark shifted in his seat. "This is messed up," he muttered. "You don't just let things collapse." I met his eyes. "I didn't let anything collapse. I stopped preventing consequences you chose not to see." My mother finally cried then. Soft, quiet tears. She reached for my hand, then hesitated, like she wasn't sure she had the right. "Please," she said. "We didn't know. We were just joking." I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. "Jokes that rely on someone staying small aren't jokes," I said. "They're control." I stood up. "Here's what's going to happen. I'm not turning the money back on. I'm not funding denial anymore. You'll deal with your banks, your debts, and your choices, like adults. If you want a relationship with me, after that one, built on respect, instead of assumptions, we can talk. But it will be on my terms." I picked up my bag and walked out. Behind me, there were no shouts, no threats, just silence. And for the first time, that silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. As someone who has spent decades studying family dynamics, I can tell you this story is far more common than most people realize. In many families, there is an unspoken system at work. One child becomes the success story. One becomes the dependable one. And sometimes, without anyone ever naming it, one becomes the cushion. The person who absorbs pressure so everyone else can stay comfortable. What makes this case especially painful is not the money. It's the invisibility. Emily wasn't punished for being irresponsible. She was punished for being capable without demanding recognition, for fixing problems quietly, for making it easy for others to believe they were standing on solid ground, when in reality, someone else was holding it up. From a professional standpoint, what she did was not revenge. It was boundary setting. When people say family should always help family, what they often mean is one person should keep paying the emotional and financial cost, so the rest of us don't have to change. That isn't love. That's avoidance. Healthy families can accept help without entitlement. Unhealthy ones rewrite generosity as obligation and boundaries as betrayal. And when that happens, stepping back is sometimes the only way the truth can surface. Notice what changed when Emily stopped intervening. The money didn't disappear. The problems didn't suddenly appear. What changed was who had to feel the consequences. That shift is uncomfortable. It often brings anger, denial, and accusations. But it also creates the first real opportunity for honesty. Not the polite kind, the kind that forces everyone to see the same reality for the first time. For viewers listening who recognize themselves in this story, here is the most important takeaway. You are not cruel for drawing a line. You are not selfish for wanting respect. And you are not obligated to keep rescuing people who refuse to see you clearly. Support given freely is a gift. Support demanded without accountability becomes a trap. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been the quiet one holding everything together, take a moment to like this video. It helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. And consider subscribing to the channel. We share these stories not for drama, but for reflection, clarity, and the kind of healing that begins when truth is finally spoken. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do for your family is to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own choices and allow yourself at last to step out of the shadows.